Most people spend their lives hoping someone remembers them. Abigail spent hers believing nobody did. Raised in foster homes, she grew up convinced she had been completely forgotten. Then one phone call changed everything. A grandfather she had never met left her a floating house on a quiet lake. Hidden inside was the answer she had been waiting her entire life to hear. Because while Abigail believed she was alone in the world, one man had spent 20 years searching for her. And the moment she discovered why, she learned that love doesn't always disappear when people do. Sometimes it keeps searching. Most people around Silverwood Lake had stopped noticing the floating house years ago. It sat quietly near the foggy edge of the lake, rocking gently with the water. Half house, half barge. It looked more like a memory than a place someone could actually live. Children called it the ghost house. Older folks claimed they sometimes saw lights glowing inside after dark, but nobody really knew who owned it anymore. And nobody seemed to care. At least, not until Abigail Collins arrived. At 24 years old, Abigail had spent most of her life feeling like she belonged nowhere. She grew up in foster homes and children's shelters, moving so often that she stopped unpacking completely. By the age of 10, she had learned not to get attached to places, to people, or to promises. There was one promise she never forgot. A week before Christmas, a family visited the children's home where she lived. They smiled at her, talked with her, told her they would come back soon. The staff helped her pack her things. Abigail folded every shirt she owned and waited by the window in a bright red sweater they had given her. She waited all afternoon. They never came. For years afterward, she kept that sweater hidden in a drawer, even after it no longer fit. It reminded her of the last time she truly believed someone was coming for her. Life moved on. She rented a small apartment above a hardware store, worked long shifts at a local diner, and tried not to think too much about the questions that had followed her since childhood. Who were her parents? Why had nobody ever looked for her? Did she belong to anyone at all? Then, one rainy afternoon, her phone rang. The call came from a lawyer. An elderly man named Thomas Collins had recently passed away, and according to his will, he had left everything he owned to her. Abigail was certain there had been a mistake. She had never heard of Thomas Collins, never met him, never seen his face. But before ending the call, the lawyer said something she couldn't stop thinking about. "Miss Collins, there's one more thing." He paused. Our records suggest Mr. Collins spent many years searching for someone. Abigail frowned. Searching for who? The answer came softly. For you? 3 days later, Abigail found herself standing at the end of an old wooden dock. A rusted brass key rested in her hand. Ahead of her floated the house Thomas Collins had left behind. Gray, weathered, silent. The morning fog drifted across the water, as though the lake itself was holding its breath. Abigail stared at the house for a long moment, and for reasons she couldn't explain, she felt something stirring deep inside her chest. Hope, the one thing she had spent years teaching herself not to feel. Slowly, she stepped forward. The old boards creaked beneath her feet. The house rocked gently against the water, and the moment her hand touched the weathered railing, a strange feeling washed over her. Not fear, not curiosity, something else. It felt like she was standing at the edge of an answer she had been waiting for her entire life. And for the first time, home didn't feel like a place. It felt like someone waiting to welcome her back. The first time Abigail stepped inside the floating house, she felt as though she had stepped into someone else's memory. The air carried the scent of cedar wood, old paper, and lake water. Sunlight filtered through aging lace curtains, casting pale patterns across the floor. Dust drifted quietly through the light, undisturbed by time. What struck her most wasn't how old the house felt. It was how loved it felt. A rocking chair still faced the lake. A coffee mug sat beside a half-finished crossword puzzle. Reading glasses rested neatly on a small desk. Everywhere she looked, there were traces of Thomas Collins. Not grand traces, ordinary ones. The kind that reminded you a real person had once lived here. A man who drank coffee in the mornings. A man who read books by the window. A man who, somehow, had spent years searching for her. That thought followed Abigail through every room. Why would someone she'd never met spend so much of his life trying to find her? The question stayed with her as afternoon slowly faded into evening. Near the back of the house, she discovered a small reading nook lined with bookshelves from floor to ceiling. She ran her fingers along the shelves absent-mindedly. Then something moved. A soft click echoed through the room. Abigail stopped. Slowly, she pushed against the wood. The bookshelf shifted. Just a few inches. Enough to reveal a small blue door hidden behind it. Her heartbeat quickened. The faded paint was chipped with age, but the brass lock at its center remained intact. Without thinking, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the rusted key the lawyer had given her. The key Thomas Collins had specifically left behind. For her, the house suddenly seemed very quiet, as if it were waiting. Abigail knelt beside the little door and slid the key into the lock. It fit perfectly. A deep, metallic click echoed through the wall. Then the door slowly creaked open. Beyond it waited a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Cool air drifted upward. Old air, the kind that had been sealed away for years. Abigail hesitated only a moment before switching on her flashlight and stepping inside. The wooden stairs groaned softly beneath her feet. One step, then another, and another. The farther she descended, the farther away the world above seemed to become. At the bottom of the staircase, her flashlight swept across a hidden chamber, and Abigail froze. The room was much larger than she expected. Several large trunks stood neatly arranged in rows. Shelves lined the walls. Boxes, photographs, bundles of letters tied carefully with ribbon. Everything had been preserved with extraordinary care, as though someone had spent a lifetime protecting it. She approached the nearest trunk and slowly lifted the lid. Inside were photographs. Hundreds of them. Families gathered around dinner tables. Children celebrating birthdays. Parents holding newborn babies. Grandparents smiling beside Christmas trees. Moments so ordinary they might have been forgotten by the people who lived them. Yet here they were. Protected. Remembered. Abigail picked up one photograph and stared at it. A little girl sat between her mother and father. All three were smiling. The father's arm rested around his daughter's shoulders. The mother's hand held hers. The picture wasn't remarkable, but Abigail couldn't stop looking at it. She wondered what it felt like to belong to someone. To know that if you disappeared, someone would come searching. She carefully placed the photograph back into the trunk, then opened another. Letters! Dozens upon dozens of them. Different handwriting, different languages, different lives. Some were faded with age. Others looked as though they had never been opened. Standing there, Abigail suddenly realized something. Every letter in this room belonged to someone. Every photograph belonged to a family. Every memory had been important enough for someone to save. And she had spent her whole life wondering whether anyone had saved anything of hers. The thought settled heavily in her chest. As she turned away, her flashlight landed on a small wooden box sitting alone on a shelf. Unlike everything else, it carried no label. Abigail opened it carefully. Inside were newspaper clippings. copies of adoption records, letters from social service agencies, search requests, pages and pages of correspondence. Her hands trembled. Then she saw the photograph, a picture of a little girl wearing a red sweater. Her red sweater, the same one she had worn while waiting by the window all those years ago. The same one she had kept hidden in a drawer long after it no longer fit. Abigail stared at the photograph. She knew that face. It was hers. Beneath it sat a handwritten note. 5 simple words. Still looking. Don't give up. For a long moment, she couldn't breathe. This wasn't a mistake. Thomas Collins hadn't stumbled across her name. He hadn't chosen her at random. He had been searching for years, maybe even decades. Tears blurred her vision. Someone had been looking for her. All this time. In the far corner of the chamber stood an old film projector. Unlike everything else in the room, it was spotless. Waiting. A single envelope rested on top. Across the front, written in careful handwriting, was one word. Abigail. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a note. If you found this, play it. Then, beneath those words, written in smaller letters, I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. The room fell silent. For 24 years, Abigail had believed nobody had come looking. Nobody had remembered. Nobody had cared. Now she sat beneath a floating house on Silverwood Lake, holding proof that someone had never stopped trying. The projector waited quietly in the darkness. And somehow, Abigail knew that the moment she pressed play, everything she believed about her life was about to change. For a long moment, Abigail couldn't move. The note rested in her trembling hands. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. The words seemed impossible. She read them again, then again. For 24 years, she had lived with the quiet belief that nobody had ever come looking. Nobody had searched. Nobody had cared enough to try. And yet here she was, sitting beneath a floating house on Silverwood Lake, holding proof that someone had. Slowly, she turned toward the projector. The machine hummed softly as she switched it on. The reel began to spin. Light flickered across the wall. Static danced across the screen. Then a face appeared. An elderly man with silver hair and tired eyes. Kind eyes. Eyes that somehow felt familiar. He looked directly into the camera, and for a moment, it felt as though he were looking directly at her. A gentle smile touched his face. Not a happy smile. The kind people wear when they've waited a very long time for something they aren't sure will ever happen. Hello, Abigail. The sound of her name nearly shattered her. He said it like it belonged to him. Like it mattered. Like she mattered. The man folded his hands together. My name is Thomas Collins. His voice was warm and steady. If you're watching this, then I wasn't lucky enough to tell you these things myself. He paused. Taking a breath, there isn't a single day that passed that I didn't think about you. Abigail felt her throat tighten. Thomas looked away briefly, as though searching through memories. Then he smiled. Your mother's name was Caroline. A softness entered his eyes. She used to sit on this very dock when she was little and feed breadcrumbs to the ducks. A small laugh escaped him. She always fed them too much. His smile grew. She had a way of making everything feel alive. Abigail listened without blinking. For the first time in her life, someone was telling her about her mother. Not a file. Not a report. Not a blank line on a government form. A real person. Thomas's eyes glistened. When Caroline became pregnant with you, she told me she was terrified. He smiled through the sadness. But she also told me something I'll never forget. His voice softened. She said, "Dad, I don't know what kind of mother I'll be, but this little girl is already the best thing that's ever happened to me." Abigail covered her mouth. Tears filled her eyes instantly. All her life she had wondered if her mother had wanted her. Now she had her answer. Thomas lowered his gaze. When Caroline died, everything happened so fast. The room seemed to grow heavier. There were mistakes. Regret filled his expression. Horrible mistakes. His voice cracked. "And when I finally realized where you had gone..." He stopped. The silence hurt more than the words. I was too late. Abigail felt her heart break for him. Thomas reached beside him and lifted a bundle of envelopes tied together with string. "Every birthday." His voice trembled. "I wrote you a letter." He looked down at them. "I didn't know where to send them." A sad smile crossed his face. "So I kept writing anyway." Abigail wiped tears from her cheeks. Thomas continued. "Every Christmas I set an extra plate at the table." His eyes shimmered. "Just in case." The words hit harder than anything else. An extra plate, year after year. A seat that remained empty, yet never removed. Abigail lowered her head. For a moment she was 8 years old again, waiting by the window in her red sweater, believing nobody was coming, and somewhere, miles away, an old man was setting a place for her at Christmas dinner, neither of them knowing the other existed. The thought was almost unbearable. Thomas looked directly into the camera. "If there's one thing I need you to know..." His voice shook. "You were never abandoned in my heart." The tears came freely now. Abigail didn't stop them. She couldn't. For years, she had carried a wound so deep she rarely allowed herself to think about it. The belief that she had been unwanted, forgotten, left behind, and now that belief was beginning to fall apart, piece by piece. Thomas smiled gently. "The floating house isn't really your inheritance." He glanced around the room. "The house is only a vessel." His eyes moved back to the camera. "The real inheritance is what's inside it." Abigail frowned slightly. Thomas continued. "For nearly 50 years, people came here carrying things they were afraid the world would forget. Letters, photographs, journals, pieces of lives, pieces of families, pieces of history. They trusted me to keep them safe." His expression grew serious. "And one day, I realized I wouldn't be here forever." The projector hummed softly. "So I began searching for someone who could continue protecting them." Thomas smiled. "I never expected that person would be my granddaughter." Abigail felt fresh tears fill her eyes. Then Thomas leaned forward slightly. "And Abigail..." His voice lowered. "There are things in those trunks I never had time to explain." His eyes carried a warning. "And there are people who know they exist." The room suddenly felt colder. "There are stories buried here that some would rather remain buried." The smile faded. "If you're watching this, be careful." Abigail sat upright. The first hint of unease crept into her chest. Thomas looked into the camera one last time. A grandfather looking at the granddaughter he had spent 20 years searching for. "I wish we had more time." His voice barely rose above a whisper. But somehow, his smile returned. "I found you..." The image flickered, then disappeared. The screen went dark. Silence filled the chamber. Abigail sat motionless. The projector continued humming softly. For a long time she simply stared. Then her eyes drifted across the room. The trunks, the letters, the photographs, the countless lives preserved in silence. This wasn't just a hidden collection. It was something far bigger. And suddenly she realized something else. Thomas had answered the question she had carried her entire life. He had loved her. He had searched for her. He had never given up. But now a new question stood before her. Who were all these other people? And why had Thomas warned her to be careful? As the projector light faded from the wall, Abigail slowly looked back at the rows of trunks waiting in the darkness. For the first time, she understood. The greatest secret beneath the floating house wasn't her family. It was everyone else's. And somehow, it now belonged to her. Abigail didn't leave the attic until the sun had begun to set beyond Silverwood Lake. The 20 birthday letters sat neatly stacked beside her, tied together once more with the faded blue ribbon Thomas had used. For hours she had read every word, every hope, every prayer, every birthday wish written by a grandfather who didn't know where his granddaughter was, yet never stopped believing he would find her. The last letter still rested in her lap. She had read it 3 times already, yet one sentence refused to leave her mind. Don't spend your life wondering if you were loved. Abigail, you were. The simplicity of those words somehow made them hurt even more. All her life, she had searched for proof that she mattered to someone. And now she sat surrounded by 20 years of evidence. Outside, the evening light painted the lake in shades of gold and amber. For the first time since arriving, Abigail no longer felt like a stranger inside the floating house. She felt connected to it, connected to Thomas, connected to a family she never knew she had. Slowly, she folded the letter and placed it back into the box. That's when she noticed something tucked beneath the bottom envelope. A small handwritten card. Unlike the others, it wasn't addressed to her. Across the front, Thomas had written, "For Abigail, when she is ready." Her heart tightened. Carefully, she opened it. Inside was a single paragraph. If you're reading this, then you've already discovered something important. You spent years believing nobody was looking for you. Now you know that isn't true. But Abigail, there is something else I hope you'll learn someday. The strongest people are not the ones who carry every burden alone. They're the ones who help carry the burdens of others. Abigail stared at the words. Then read them again. Something shifted inside her. All her life she had been searching for family, searching for answers, searching for a place where she belonged. And for the first time, she wondered if perhaps that wasn't the reason Thomas had left her the floating house. Maybe he hadn't only wanted her to find her past. Maybe he wanted her to help preserve the past of others. The thought stayed with her as she carried the letters downstairs. That evening she sat at Thomas's desk and opened the leather journal she had found. The deeper she read, the more extraordinary the story became. The entries stretched back decades. Year after year, page after page. Families had arrived at the floating house carrying pieces of their lives. A photograph rescued from a war. A diary hidden during political unrest. Letters exchanged between sweethearts separated by oceans. Wedding rings. Military medals. Children's drawings. Objects that seemed small to the world but meant everything to someone. Many had entrusted those memories to Thomas for safekeeping. Others had asked him to help reunite lost items with descendants they could no longer find. Abigail slowly lowered the journal. This wasn't a hobby. This wasn't a collection. This was a life's work. For nearly 50 years, Thomas Collins had become a guardian of memory, a protector of stories, a keeper of promises. Near the back of the journal, one sentence was underlined twice. Some memories survive because someone chooses not to let them disappear. Abigail sat quietly. Then her eyes drifted toward the hidden blue door, toward the room below, toward the countless photographs and letters waiting in the darkness. For a long moment, she thought about turning away, selling the house, returning to her old life. No responsibilities, no expectations, no heartbreak. It would certainly be easier, Then she looked down at Thomas's final letter, and suddenly she knew she couldn't. Not anymore. Because for 24 years, one man had refused to give up on her. How could she give up on the people whose stories he had spent a lifetime protecting? A quiet determination settled inside her, the kind that doesn't arrive with excitement, the kind that arrives with purpose. For the first time in her life, Abigail wasn't searching for family. She was protecting one. The realization surprised her, yet it felt right, more right than anything had in years. As darkness settled across the lake, she returned to the hidden chamber once more. This time she wasn't looking for answers. She was looking for understanding. She moved slowly between the trunks, reading labels, studying names, touching the edges of lives she had never known. Then she noticed something unusual. Inside one trunk was a ledger listing dozens of families whose items remained unclaimed. Beside several names, Thomas had written notes. Granddaughter still searching. Family line may continue in Oregon. Last known relative contacted in 2011. Abigail stared at the pages. Even in his final years, Thomas had still been trying to reconnect people with their histories, still trying to bring families home. A lump formed in her throat. Just then, her phone vibrated. The sound startled her in the silence. She pulled it from her pocket. An email notification. The sender was unfamiliar. Abigail almost ignored it. Then she opened the message. The subject line read, "Regarding Thomas Collins' archive." Her heartbeat quickened. The message itself was short. "Ms. Collins, if Thomas left the archive to you, please contact me. My grandmother spent nearly 60 years searching for something she entrusted to him. Before she passed away last month, she made me promise I would continue looking. I believe one of the items in that collection belongs to my family." Abigail stared at the screen, then looked around the hidden chamber. The photographs, the letters, the trunks, the names. Suddenly, everything felt different. For the first time, she understood something Thomas had known all along. The stories beneath the floating house weren't relics. They weren't artifacts. They weren't treasures. They were unfinished journeys. And somewhere beyond the walls of this hidden room, there were people still searching. Just as she once had. Abigail looked down at the message again. Then, back at the rows of trunks stretching into the shadows. A slow breath escaped her. Perhaps this was how it began. Not with history, not with secrets, but with helping one family find its way home. And somewhere deep inside, she had a feeling Thomas was smiling. The next morning, Abigail woke before sunrise. For a few moments, she lay still, listening to the gentle sound of water brushing against the floating house. The previous day's discoveries felt almost unreal. Thomas! The letters. The hidden archive. The message from the stranger searching for a family heirloom. Only a week earlier. Her biggest concern had been paying next month's rent. Now she was responsible for something far larger than herself. A responsibility she still wasn't sure she was ready for. Coffee in hand. Abigail sat at Thomas's old desk and reread the email. The sender's name was Eleanor Price. Attached was a photograph, a faded black and white image of a young woman standing beside a train station. On the back, someone had written, "To Eleanor, until we meet again." The date beneath it was nearly 70 years old. Abigail stared at the photograph. Then she opened the journal and searched for the surname. Price. There it was. A single entry from 1961. A note written in Thomas's careful handwriting. Photograph entrusted by Margaret Price. Requested return to family if descendants located. Abigail's heart skipped. The photograph wasn't simply part of a collection. Someone had been waiting decades to find it. Someone had trusted Thomas to keep a promise, and now that promise belonged to her. For the next several hours, Abigail searched through the trunks. Eventually, she found a small envelope tucked inside a weathered storage box. Inside was the photograph, perfectly preserved, 70 years of waiting, and somehow it had survived. Abigail sat quietly for a moment, thinking. Then she picked up her phone and replied, "I believe I found it." She wasn't prepared for what happened next. 2 days later, Eleanor Price arrived at Silverwood Lake. She was in her 60s, soft-spoken, nervous. The moment Abigail handed her the photograph, Eleanor began to cry. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. The way people cry when something broken inside them finally begins to heal. For several minutes, neither woman said much. Eleanor simply stared at the picture, running her fingers gently across its edges. "My grandmother searched for this her entire life," she whispered. "She thought it was gone forever." Abigail felt a lump rise in her throat. She understood that feeling. The fear of losing something important. The fear of never finding it again. Before leaving, Eleanor hugged her. A real hug. The kind that lingers. The kind that says thank you without words. And just before she walked away, she said something Abigail would never forget. "You gave my family a piece of itself back." That night, Abigail sat alone on the dock long after sunset. The lake was calm. The stars reflected on the water. And for the first time, she truly understood what Thomas had spent his life doing. He hadn't been collecting objects. He had been reuniting people with pieces of their hearts. The realization changed everything. Over the following weeks, Abigail began organizing the archive. One trunk at a time. One photograph at a time. One story at a time. The work was overwhelming. Yet she couldn't stop. Every item seemed connected to a real person. A real family. A real loss. Then, one evening, she made a decision. She created a simple website. Nothing fancy. Just a few photographs and a short explanation. She called it the Silverwood Memory Archive. At the bottom of the page, she added a single sentence. "If you recognize someone here, please contact us." At first, nothing happened. A few visitors. A handful of emails. Then, suddenly, everything changed. Messages began arriving from across the country. Then from Canada. Then from Europe. People recognized faces. Names. Letters. Military medals. Family heirlooms. Every day brought new stories. New connections. New reunions. Some messages were only a few lines long. Others stretched for pages. Many ended the same way. "Thank you." One afternoon, Abigail opened an email from a man in Chicago. Attached was a photograph of an elderly woman holding a letter she had believed lost for more than 50 years. Another came from a family in Maine who discovered the only surviving photograph of a great-grandfather they had never seen before. Then came a message from a retired schoolteacher in Texas. She simply wrote, "For the first time, my grandchildren know where they came from." Abigail read that email 3 times, then sat quietly staring at the screen. The floating house was changing lives. Not because of what it contained, but because of what it returned. Hope, a connection, belonging. The very thing she had spent most of her life searching for. As autumn slowly gave way to winter, the archive continued growing. So did the attention. Local newspapers began calling. Historians reached out. Genealogists offered assistance. People wanted to know more about Thomas Collins and the mysterious floating house on Silverwood Lake. But not all the attention was welcome. One evening, As Abigail prepared to close the house for the night, she noticed something unusual. A boat sat offshore, and farther out on the lake. Its lights were off, its engine silent. Someone was watching. At first, she told herself it was nothing. Probably a fisherman. Probably someone curious about the stories appearing online. Yet, something about it felt wrong. The boat remained there for nearly an hour, motionless, waiting. Then, just before midnight, it disappeared into the darkness. Abigail stood on the dock long after it was gone. A cold wind swept across the water. For the first time in weeks, she remembered Thomas's warning. There are people who know the archive exists. Be careful. The lake had become quiet once again. But this time, the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt like the calm before something else arrived. And somewhere beyond the darkness, someone else had begun paying attention to the floating house. Winter arrived quietly at Silverwood Lake. The trees along the shoreline stood bare against the gray sky, and thin sheets of ice began forming along the edges of the water each morning. Inside the floating house, however, life had never been busier. Every day brought new emails, new photographs, new stories, new families searching for pieces of their past. Abigail often worked late into the night, surrounded by boxes, journals, and stacks of letters spread across Thomas's old desk. Sometimes she would glance toward the rocking chair beside the window and imagine him sitting there, watching, smiling, proud. The thought gave her strength, because the work was becoming harder, much harder. As news of the archive spread, not everyone agreed with what she was doing. A local historian publicly criticized her. According to him, the collection belonged in a major institution, not in the hands of a 24-year-old former foster child. Others questioned her qualifications. Some accused her of seeking attention. One online article even described her as an inexperienced young woman managing one of the most significant private historical collections in the region. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. For most of her life, Abigail had struggled with the feeling that she wasn't enough. Not smart enough, not important enough, not worthy enough. Now those old fears were returning. One snowy evening, after reading another harsh article, she sat alone in the archive room beneath the house. The criticism echoed in her mind. Maybe they were right. Maybe she wasn't the person Thomas should have trusted. Maybe someone else could do this better. Her eyes drifted toward the cedar chest containing the birthday letters. Slowly, she opened it. She didn't know why. Perhaps she simply needed to hear Thomas's voice again. The letter she chose was written on her 18th birthday, the year she had officially aged out of the foster care system, the year she had been completely on her own. She unfolded the page. The paper crackled softly. Then she began reading. Dear Abigail, if you're anything like your mother, you're probably trying to carry the weight of the world by yourself. A faint smile touched her face. Thomas continued. Caroline hated asking for help. She believed strength meant handling everything alone. She was wrong. Abigail paused. The words felt strangely personal, as though Thomas knew exactly what she needed to hear. She continued reading. The strongest people I've ever known weren't the ones who carried every burden. They were the ones brave enough to let others carry it with them. Abigail stared at the page. For a long moment, she simply sat there. Then she looked around the archive. Thousands of memories. Thousands of stories. Thousands of lives. Perhaps Thomas had never intended for her to do this alone. The realization changed something. The very next week, Abigail reached out for help. Historians, archivists, genealogists, volunteers. To her surprise, many responded immediately, not because of the collection, because of the mission. Soon, retired teachers were helping organize records. Former librarians volunteered to catalog documents. Genealogy experts offered their services for free. One retired veteran spent hours helping identify military photographs. For the first time, Abigail wasn't carrying the burden alone, and the archive grew stronger because of it. Spring arrived early that year. With it came more visitors. Families traveled from across the country to see the floating house. Some came searching for answers. Others came simply to thank her. One afternoon, an elderly man stood silently in front of a photograph for nearly 20 minutes. When Abigail finally approached, tears filled his eyes. "I haven't seen my mother's face since I was 7 years old," he whispered. "My family thought every picture had been destroyed." He couldn't stop looking at the image, and neither could Abigail. Moments like that reminded her why the work mattered, why Thomas had dedicated his life to it, why she couldn't walk away. Yet, as the archive's reputation grew, so did the challenges. One morning, Abigail arrived at the hidden chamber and immediately knew something was wrong. A storage cabinet stood partially open. She was certain she had locked it the night before. Her stomach tightened. She quickly inspected the room. At first glance, everything appeared normal. The trunks remained untouched. The shelves looked undisturbed. Then she noticed an empty space. A small velvet-lined box was missing. Abigail froze. She hurried to the inventory records. Her hands shook as she checked the entry. The missing item was an antique gold pocket watch. More important than its value was the story attached to it. The watch had belonged to a soldier who never returned home after World War II. His family had been searching for it for decades. Someone had taken it. Fear settled heavily in her chest. Thomas's warning suddenly returned with frightening clarity. There are people who know the archive exists. Be careful. For the first time, the threat felt real. Not distant. Not theoretical. Real. That evening, Abigail sat alone on the dock, watching the sunset. The missing watch wasn't just an object. It represented trust. A promise. Someone had entrusted that memory to Thomas. And now, under her care, it was gone. The failure weighed heavily on her. As darkness settled across the lake, she found herself thinking about the frightened young woman who had first arrived here months earlier. That version of Abigail would have run, would have doubted herself, would have walked away. But she wasn't that person anymore. The floating house had changed her. The families had changed her. Thomas had changed her. She looked across the water and made a silent promise. No matter who had taken the watch, no matter how difficult things became, she would find it. She would protect the archive, and she would honor the trust Thomas Collins had placed in her, because this wasn't just his mission anymore. It was hers, and somewhere out on the darkening lake, hidden beyond the fading light, someone else was already making their next move. 5 years later, people traveled from all over the country to visit the floating house on Silverwood Lake. Some came searching for family history. Some came searching for answers. And some came simply because they had heard the story of a young woman who inherited a forgotten house and turned it into something extraordinary. What had once been known as the Ghost House was now known by a very different name: the Silverwood Memory House. The floating house had become a place where lost stories found their way home. By then, more than 3,000 photographs had been reunited with families. Hundreds of letters had been returned to descendants who never knew they existed. Military medals, journals, wedding rings, and family heirlooms once believed lost forever had found their way back into waiting hands. The work had changed countless lives, but perhaps no life had changed more than Abigail's. The frightened young woman who arrived carrying years of loneliness and unanswered questions was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who had finally discovered where she belonged, not because she had found all the answers, but because she had found a purpose. On a warm spring evening, the floating house hosted its annual gathering of memories. Families arrived from dozens of states. Some brought photographs. Others brought stories. Many brought children and grandchildren. For one evening each year, strangers gathered beside the lake and shared pieces of their past. As the sun began to set, hundreds of people filled the shoreline. Laughter drifted across the water. Old friends embraced. Families met relatives they never knew existed. And everywhere Abigail looked, she saw something she once believed would never be part of her life. Connection, belonging, home. As the ceremony began, volunteers handed out small paper boats. It had become a tradition started by Thomas years before. Each visitor wrote the name of someone they wanted to remember. A parent, a grandparent, a sibling, a friend, someone whose story deserved to live on. Then, as twilight settled over Silverwood Lake, the boats were released onto the water. Hundreds of tiny lanterns floated across the lake like stars. The sight never failed to take Abigail's breath away. She stood quietly at the end of the dock watching them drift into the evening. 5 years earlier, she had stood on this same dock feeling completely alone. Now she was surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had become connected through the work Thomas began. The realization still felt miraculous. As darkness deepened, the crowd gathered near the shoreline for the final presentation of the evening. A large screen displayed photographs from the archive, images of families reunited, stories recovered, memories preserved. The audience watched in silence. Some smiled, some cried. Many did both. Then a familiar photograph appeared on the screen. A little girl wearing a red sweater. Abigail's photograph. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd. Most visitors knew the story by now. The orphan who inherited the floating house. The grandfather who never stopped searching. The 20 birthday letters. The years of waiting. Abigail felt emotion rise in her chest. Even after all this time, the story still affected her. Then another image appeared. Thomas Collins, smiling beside the lake. The crowd applauded softly. Many of them had never met him. Yet all of them knew what he had built. A legacy of remembrance. A legacy of compassion. A legacy of second chances. When the applause faded, Abigail stepped toward the microphone. For a moment, she simply looked at the crowd, at the families, at the children sitting on blankets beside their grandparents, at the people who had traveled hundreds of miles because of a memory. Then she began to speak. When I first arrived here, I thought I had inherited a floating house. A gentle laugh moved through the audience. Abigail smiled. But I was wrong. She paused. I inherited a promise. Silence settled across the shoreline. A promise that no one should ever be forgotten. Her voice softened. For most of my life, I believed I was alone. She glanced toward the floating house behind her. I believed nobody had been looking for me. Many in the audience lowered their eyes. Some already knew what came next. Then Abigail smiled. The greatest gift my grandfather ever gave me wasn't this house. It wasn't the archive. It wasn't even the answers I spent my whole life searching for. A tear slipped down her cheek. The greatest gift he gave me was the certainty that I had always been loved. The crowd remained completely silent, listening, feeling, remembering. Abigail looked out across the water, toward the hundreds of lanterns floating in the darkness. Then she spoke the words she wished Thomas could have heard. Thank you for finding me. For a moment, she couldn't continue. Emotion caught in her throat. The audience waited patiently. many wiping away tears of their own. Finally, Abigail smiled and looked toward the stars beginning to appear overhead. "I think he did." The crowd rose to its feet, not because of the floating house, not because of the archive, but because everyone understood the truth behind the story. Every person wants to know they mattered. Every person wants to know they were remembered. Every person wants to know they were loved. As applause echoed across Silverwood Lake, Abigail looked toward the floating house one last time. The windows glowed warmly in the darkness, just as they had the night she first arrived. Only now, she understood what she had felt that day. It wasn't a house waiting for her, it was family. And after a lifetime of searching, she had finally come home. Years later, visitors often asked Abigail the same question. What was the most valuable thing Thomas Collins left you? Some expected her to say the floating house. Others thought it was the archive hidden beneath it. But Abigail always gave the same answer. Neither. Then she would smile. The greatest gift he left me was knowing I was loved. Because for 24 years, Abigail believed nobody had been looking for her. Nobody remembered. Nobody cared. Then she discovered the truth. An old man had spent 20 years searching for his granddaughter. 20 years writing birthday letters he could never send. 20 years refusing to give up hope. And that changed everything. One evening, during the annual gathering of memories, Abigail stood beside the lake and read a few lines from Thomas's final letter. If you're reading this, Abigail, please remember something your mother once told me. No one is beyond being loved. Not you, not the people whose stories fill these rooms, not even those who feel forgotten. The crowd sat in silence, many wiping away tears, many thinking about people they wished they could see one more time. Then Abigail looked across the water at hundreds of lanterns floating through the darkness, and she finally understood what Thomas had spent his life protecting. Not photographs, not letters, not heirlooms. People, their memories, their stories, their place in the world. Years earlier, Abigail believed she was an orphan with no family. But the truth was much simpler. She had never been without family. She had only been separated from it. And the greatest miracle wasn't that Thomas left her a floating house. The miracle was that he never stopped looking. Some people leave behind money. Some leave behind property. Thomas Collins left behind something far more valuable. Proof that no one is beyond being loved. And sometimes, the people searching for us never stop, even when we cannot see them, even when years pass, even when hope feels impossible. Love